It took me a lot of energy to resist playing Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 right as it came out last year. I don't have enough words to describe how much I appreciate the first game, so it was beyond obvious I was going to jump on Workhorse's sequel sooner or later. But you know what they say, it's better to leave a good meal to rest a bit before serving it. Jesus, I really did write this with an empty stomach, didn't I? It just so happens that now all the planned DLCs were released, so I can talk about each of them in the same video, and it gave enough time to the modding scene to do its thing, so I can start the game with 50 mods loaded up because I can't help myself, please understand me. Was it worth the wait? No reason to beat around the bush. It not only was worth it, but it generally surpassed my expectations. Where the first game stumbled, the sequel soars. Where the first janks it up, the second impresses. And what the first did well, the second pushes it even further. But what kind of a person would I be if I left it at that instead of going over in detail? If I was able to muster almost an hour talking about the first game over 4 years ago, surely I can spare some time now as well, right? Wait a minute, it's been 4 years, gee. But before we carry on, a reminder that I have a Patreon page which you can support to your heart's content. You're also more than welcome to leave your thoughts, click the fancy buttons and share this video with your like-minded fellows. With this out of the way, let's ride onwards. Nice pun, eh? For those who don't know, Kingdom Come Deliverance is an RPG set in the 15th century Czechia, in which you play as Henry, a blacksmith's son, as he goes on his quest to avenge the death of his family at the hands of an invading army. This takes place in the context of a real war that took place over the throne of Bohemia between the then current King Wenceslas and his brother Sigismund of Luxembourg, so we're talking about a setting that's deeply anchored in history. After the numerous adventures from the first game, the second starts mere days later of its conclusion, with Henry and his liege lord Sir Hans delivering a diplomatic message to another lord in hopes of brokering a deal and potentially stopping the war. Yeah, it's a massive oversimplification, but I really can't start my video going in dry discussing medieval politics in depth. Come on, I know I'm a small bean in this YouTube landscape, but I have some standards. I heard about audience retention, okay? Anyway, on their trip, Sir Hans orders the company to make camp next to a picturesque lake for the evening. The apparent calmness is quickly interrupted by a group of bandits that attack and massacre everyone except Henry and Sir Hans that were conveniently sneaking in the reeds in search for women to, interact with. I think the lesson to learn from this is that being an insatiable horn dog keeps you alive in times of need. The two are quickly chased through the woods and they escape death by the skin of their teeth thanks to the help of a secluded herb woman they stumble upon that treated their gruesome injuries afterwards. After a slow recovery and despite losing all their equipment, clothes and even the message itself, they persevere and make their way to the destination of Trosky Castle. But after arriving there, they get chased away from the gates due to being mistaken for beggars and get buckets of shit thrown at them for good measure. Trying to drown their sorrow over their misfortune, the two promptly start a brawl at the local tavern and end up being sent to the pillory. And with this, the game's introductory segment reaches its conclusion. Honestly, this whole series of events is a pretty damn hilarious way to set up the game's introduction. Who knew that nobody would believe you're a nobleman if you're wearing rags, right? This kind of very obvious things presented in the most humorous way possible is a perfect representation of the tone adopted by the entire game. It approaches a lot of serious and complex themes, as you'll see, but for the most part it adopts a light-hearted attitude about things. At the same time, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is still an open world game despite the first impression it may create, but these long sort of on-rails sections will keep popping up during the main story in important moments. The set pieces are pretty damn spectacular and well made as the game goes on, so I don't find a particular problem in their existence. I'm just mentioning this because some might look at this introduction and mistake the game for being linear in its entirety when it's not. Role-playing role-playing games have a tough time setting up their sequels, not necessarily from the storytelling aspect, but from the mechanical side. After all, how do you make the second title interesting by transitioning the fully geared up, maxed out character players had at the end of the first game after hours of sweat and toil? Fortunately, Kingdom Come 2, and yes, I'll just call it that because it's a goddamn mouthful to keep repeating in its full name, and the initials flow as smoothly as a triple fracture of my tongue, avoid the tired trope of amnesiac protagonists. Gothic 2, yes, I'll get to you, you thirsty bastards, does this and it's just lame. In Kingdom Come 2, Henry has a good excuse to lose all his gear. He was stranded in the lake when bandits killed all his companions, and the grievous injuries he goes through are good enough of an explanation for dropping a lot of levels in his skills. Okay, at one stage he justifies needing to relearn a lot of stuff on being more self-conscious, which, come on man, this shit's embarrassing, leave the therapy talk to others. But otherwise it has a satisfying pre-game setup to link up possible choices made during the first game. But there's one thing I have to admit is bugging me. It's about the fact that the game considers it canon that Henry is able to read, when this was an entirely optional skill you could avoid learning in the first game. I'm not gonna go and say it's the worst thing that has ever happened in gaming history or anything like that. We know it's the black but it's a bit sad that this role-playing choice is made irrelevant. And yes, I can understand why they did it. The start of the game includes a full tutorial of the alchemy mechanic, which involves reading the recipes from your book. So it's a bit the case of painting yourself in the corner from Warhorse. But man, the reading mechanic in the first game was so fun, starting from the complete gibberish to slowly understanding letters and seeing them arranged in the correct order as Henry was becoming better and better at reading. It's a shame Warhorse couldn't find a way to reintroduce this in the sequel. You could have just had the old woman verbally instruct Henry for the first preparation and have him mumble the recipes to himself from the start of the game. That could have also made sense in game and kept the possibility of starting illiterate. Ah well. But now that you're free to do anything you want, the world is your oyster. Or at least the whole region of Trosky, which at first glance is smaller than the first game's map. This is only an illusion, since it quickly becomes obvious that not only more of it is explorable, but it's also chock full of activities. In the early stages of the game, your map is peppered with a bunch of quest indicators pointing you to NPCs that are ready to give you something to do. Of course, the concern when hearing this is that there would be a lot of padding and repetitiveness, but Kingdom Come 2 does a brilliant job in making the time spent doing them worthwhile. First of all, they have an excellent degree of variety, both in terms of how they play out and the story behind each of them. I never felt I was doing the same things over and over again whenever I was sent out to do something, which is very impressive considering just how many side quests are there to do. For example, you perform a series of tasks for the region's gamekeepers that involves things like rescuing a huntsman from a pack of wolves and then carrying his drunken ass after he breaks his leg jumping out of the tree.
What the hell are you doing? I'll break my legs if you don't make room for me down there. Jesus!
Which way?
That way!
For Christ's sake, I can't see where you're pointing.
Epic! Epic!
Epic!
Epic!
Epic!
Epic!
Epic!
Nothing.
Then trying to investigate the connection between a tanner and a poacher, then encountering a whole bandit company while investigating another poaching case. At another stage, you're getting yourself involved in the pranks two rival villages are playing on each other, such as herding a flock of sheep onto the fresh laundry set to dry before scattering them into the forest, or giving a prized white bull a fresh coat of a very black paint, finishing with you settling the dispute regarding the border of the grazing area each village has by relying on old vague records and a search that's close to finding a needle in the haystack. These are just a random selection I could think of, because otherwise you have to deal with the problems a gypsy camp has to face, or helping the herbalist that saved your life find her daughter, or assisting a blacksmith's ambition to reforge a Damascus steel sword, or going on a goose chase for a miller that's not only a thief, but a mad scientist as well. And I don't think anyone's in shock to hear that there's a lot of funny material to boot. The lightheartedness I mentioned earlier is more than present in many of these. Suspiciously many revolve around getting blasted with alcohol.
Singing, shagging, shagging, shag. Singing, shagging. Singing, shag.
Jij de kenne shake it shake.
I ducky now, shake its egg.
Jer McCain share no Greenock.
Carry King, shield not green ups.
On jij sheer barbarol knock.
I like sheer barbarian luck.
Million heather emberack.
Million heave ho amber egg.
If that wasn't enough, quests tend to have the quality of always surprising you, because often the initial premise gets turned around in unpredictable ways. One of the early quests is to find your dog who ran away during the introduction, and my expectation was that I'd just show up around the lake, get to the area search quest marker thingy, and that would be it. What I got instead was the herb woman telling me to ask the nearby innkeeper, who then gave me multiple leads, one leading to the drunk hunter I mentioned earlier, and another to the shepherd that has a hilarious ram you need to protect over the curse of multiple tasks.
How are you, Ignatius? Sorry. I thought now that we're partners, you'd be a bit more talkative.
So not only I ended up doing a lot more things than just finding my dog, but I was also incentivized to explore and interact with more NPCs that had their own fair share of tasks, branching out and sending you all across the map. If this isn't a sign of an extremely well thought out quest system design, I don't know what else to say. And that's just one example. The game just keeps throwing around exciting adventures one after another in ways that don't stop surprising me. Then there's the meat and potatoes of an RPG, which is its RPG system. Anyway, things are mostly the same as the first game, but there's a dose of streamlining as well. You can lay down the pitchforks because it's done correctly and decreases what's already a pretty dense list of skills and perks while not altering the way the game is played. For example, defense became part of the warfare skill, while lockpicking and pickpocketing were merged into thievery, with no reduction of either of the two mechanics. So, as expected, all skills increase every time you use them, and as you level them up, they offer access to perks that unlock various abilities of a varying degree of power. I'm not gonna dive deep into the particularities of these perks or their balance, but all I have to say is that they killed my boy herbalism. The hours spent giga leveling Henry and making him filthy rich in Scalis right before the attack are now just a distant memory. Besides this cleanup, there's also the fact that some of the stuff was actually expanded and there are a few additions as well. And what better way to begin this topic than with those that will definitely not help me beat the allegation: stealth and thievery. Now, to be more precise, the skills themselves work in similar ways as before. Stealth helps you sneak better, while also factoring in the conspicuousness, visibility and noise attributes of the items you wear, which I still believe is a really neat way to go about things. Then you have the mechanic of lockpicking, which is still gamey but functional and still sort of immersive. After all, when you start prodding a lock, you're not transported into a minigame that exists separate to the game's world, but instead you get to see and hear what's going on around you. It's been a long time since I last played the first game, so I can't compare, but early on lockpicking is pretty hard to pull off in this one. Therefore, it's definitely rewarding to unlock chests and doors. Pickpocketing, on the other hand, is basically unchanged, at least in its UI, which is separated to the rest of the game. The only difference here is that now pouches are physical items which you have to target when you want to steal an NPC's items, which is not a very significant difference, I suppose. I mean, you kind of have to target your reticle around the pouch, so it's a bit more difficult, but you get the point anyway. But the biggest addition relevant to these two skills is the increased complexity of the whole crime system. Not only do people take note of the increased crime in the area, just like in the first game, but the way they do about it is a lot more realistic. For example, if you break into a restricted area, people will notice doors that were left unlocked or open. If you unlock a chest, they will check to see if there's anything missing from there as well. When they become aware a crime has been committed, they will go to a guard and inform them, and that guard can patrol the location searching for anything suspicious. And on top of that, the next of day, all guards will know about the crime and adjust their behavior accordingly, from offhanded comments to initiating random searches looking for something valuable that you stole. At the same time, if you commit a crime and someone sees you around the time it happens, they will suspect you even if you did nothing illegal in their direct presence. And the last detail that I love a bunch is that if you wear something you stole around the location you found, NPCs will immediately accuse you of theft and report you to the guards. I had two major complaints about the first game's stealth system. The first was that the equipment's attributes relevant to stealth encouraged you to do the silly but efficient thing of going into your inventory and switching gear whenever you needed to sneak around. I'm happy to say that you can still do that. But wait, that's not okay. Now you can do it much more efficiently with the outfit system. The inventory allows you to configure up to 3 different equipment setups that you can then switch between at the press of a button. You're ready to get in combat? You can select the outfit in which you wear all the plate armor and chainmail. Need to impress the nobles and plebs alike? You can put all your snazzy clothes into another. And naturally, all the thieving gear gets its own outfit for instant min-maxing. You know, there's something charming in a developer that sees a feature used in absurd ways and addresses it by completely streamlining it. This is a word of advice for developers in general. If you ever end up against the player's instinct to min-max, you've already lost and it's time to appease them. It always works, by the way. The second complaint was regarding the poor AI, which was either dumb or irritatingly inconsistent with its behavior in detection. Fortunately, this time around the AI is visibly better, which is something that's reflected in other parts of the game too, as I'll mention later. As far as stealth goes, it's much more consistent, and the already mentioned additions make the experience pretty damn immersive. It's helped by an excellently designed detection UI represented by this rabbit here. The more it raises its ears, the closer an NPC is to detecting you, and you also have distinct images for when people are searching for a suspect, looking for you specifically, telling you to fuck off from their house, and so on. Oh no, it's a fucking hare, it's not a rabbit, you nerd. It's fairly clear to me that Warhorse paid more attention to stealth and crime, and that makes me very happy. Not saying this is the perfect reincarnation of Thief, but the improvements are obvious.
Please, look at me. Do I look like a dishonest man? This is all just a misunderstanding.
Oh, I apologize, my lord. I must have made a mistake. Let's just forget about this.
Unfortunately, there's a dark side to all of this. More specifically, the system only works well early on. The moment your stealth and thievery skills reach up to high levels, many of the things I said become more and more irrelevant. You end up being able to pickpocket anyone with maximum number of seconds with very little risk of being detected. You can pick the hardest locks effortlessly, and after a certain point, the detection system just breaks. Like, you can still be detected, of course, but you're able to sneak around in full plate armor and chainmail mere meters away from people, and they won't take notice of you. I get that leveling up should improve your character in an RPG, but I don't think it should trivialize an entire game mechanic, and certainly not as early as when I noticed this happen. Speaking of trivializing, I definitely have to mention the whole horse situation. Man, I'm good at transitions. After you finish the introduction, you're left with no horse, as Pebbles, the first game's starting horse, runs away, and thus it's one of the things you need to solve early on alongside getting better gear and more money. All's well and fine, especially since there's a horse trader where you can peruse your options. There you will also find Pebbles, which you can get for free if you pass a speech check, but it's pretty cheap regardless. Well, okay, I suppose that's already one part of the early game grind gone. And if you keep playing a bit more through the story, you'll get offered another horse for free, which, fair enough, once again, it's done so players will definitely not miss out on the trusted steed, as traveling by foot would make things take forever. These two horses have among the worst stats in the game, so they're just crutches and nothing more, as you still have to spend a pretty penny if you want to get something better after all. Or at least it seems like that until you discover that both of them can unlock a hidden perk if you ride them long enough. What does this do, you might ask? Well, my dear friends, it simply turns these two horses from the worst to the absolute best in Kingdom Come 2. I have absolutely no idea why would anyone decide to have this feature in the game. The requirement to trigger is pretty low as well, so unless you don't fight pebbles early on and you bought a better horse than herring by the time you're offered to take it, it's next to impossible to skip a horse you have no reason to exchange with any other until the end of the game. No, the end of the game, not even the first segment or whatever. Since there's supposed to be a big money sink, the complete lack of reason to engage in horse trading ends up amplifying the issues with the economy that I'll talk about later. In short, this one gets a big nay from me. Who the fuck writes this, man? On a more positive note, now we go to the first major addition of Kingdom Come 2, which is the integration of smithing into the whole crafting system. Yes, finally the feature whose absence was sticking out the most in the first game makes its appearance. I said in the past that the first Kingdom Come was extremely ambitious, so it's not surprising some features fell through the cracks. But now we finally get to see Henry practicing his trade. How does it work? Firstly, you can only forge weapons and horseshoes at the smithy, no armors and any other kind of stuff like this. To start making something, you need to learn schematics, get your ass at the forge and have the necessary ingredients. The minigame starts with you heating up the iron in the forge until it's right color, then transferring it to the anvil where you hammer it until it's nicely shaped up and finally quenching it. That's the short way of describing it, at least. In reality, each stage has its own set of nuances and diegetic ways of conveying information back to the player. For example, you're told from the start that the iron has to be heated up until it has a straw color and you have to move it across the forge to heat it up evenly. I only relied on my eyes and Henry's scared claims that I'm getting it too hot, but I guess my eyesight isn't that good, huh? When hammering it on the anvil, you can control the position of your hammer and then hold the left click to charge in a strike. Good strikes give a nice spark and a nice clean cling sound, but if you insist on the same spot for too long, it will sound something closer to the metal pipe meme if it was depressed and the wife took the kids. On swords it's fairly straightforward to adjust the strike position, but on horseshoes and axes the system is a bit of a nightmare to get adjusted, at least until you get used to it. Considering that putting a cursor or indicator on the anvil would ruin the immersiveness and forcing shadows to appear under your hammer would look silly, I think the best alternative would have been to only allow you to cover the surface of the horseshoe or axe blade instead of the whole anvil. I don't understand why you can smack around the objects when making them to begin with, because when making swords you can only cover the surface of the iron, nothing else beyond that. The game also has a mechanic which allows you to save stamina by timing your strikes with the rhythm of Henry's whistling, which I think is a pretty cool feature. What I don't think it's cool is the fucking troll blacksmith whistling at the same damn time and throwing me off as a consequence. I swear to God Warhorse did this on purpose. Motherfucker, I'm working here, give me a fucking break. I think it's a good addition to the game overall. It suffers a bit from its lack of variation and it doesn't have the same amount of complexity as alchemy. This is a matter of taste, but alchemy is still the cozy ASMR experience, so blacksmithing cannot compete with this unfortunately. It's a shame there's nothing about forging any kind of armor or handling some chainmail, but that's more me wanting to see the process done through the eyes of Henry rather than the plausibility of it actually becoming part of the game. After all, forging weapons and armor were two very different processes and smiths were specialized on one of them rather than both. Anyway, it's very ironic that we finally get the smithing we've all clamored for in the first game, and I proceed to complain by saying, but what about armor? Subscribe for more level-headed video game analysis, boys. I hoped I'd move this complaint further down the road or a video, but I simply can't go on anymore. You see, you can start forging regardless if the required ingredients are in your inventory or moved to your horse's saddlebags, which is extremely convenient. The more observant among you will be caught by surprise that I praise a feature as a follow-up to a warning of me criticizing something, which makes me very proud of you for noticing my efforts. You are noticed. Well then, allow me to illuminate and present to you the fucking inventory system. Oh God, not again! As it pertains to this topic, what I just described earlier is the only instance where your horse's inventory counts for an action you can take. If you approach the alchemy bench, you need the ingredients in your own pockets before you proceed. If you want to sell something in a store, you have to move stuff from the saddlebags first. Totally not tedious, just like in the first game by the way. If you want to repair any piece of equipment with a repair kit, you need both items on your person because fuck you, that's why. I have no idea why smithing is the only exception to the rule and nothing was done for all the other situations where Henry and the horse inventory are treated as being on different planets. I generally don't get it. The only moments you're restricted from moving inventory between you and your horse is when you're in a restricted area, which is something that never happens when performing any of the activities I mentioned earlier. The issue is further compounded by your carrying capacity, or more precisely, its unreliability. The basic thing is that strength is the only stat determining how much you can stuff in your inventory, alongside a few perks dedicated to carrying capacity. That's all nice and fine until you consider that a significant number of perks influence strength under some conditions, and those conditions aren't permanently met. Some increase it if you killed someone in combat, others if you're inside a settlement, committing a crime, and so on. If you're the kind of person that gets as close as possible to the weight limit, the fact that you can randomly lose a couple of strength points means you'll often end up over-encumbered seemingly out of the blue. It does not help that there is also a long list of status effects that influence this, which you can browse in the menu, but unfortunately without any indication as to the values of their effects. Same goes for looking at your general stats. The game shows that you got a buff or a nerf, but there's no way to see the detailed list of how they affect your stats in general. So most of the time you don't understand why your current skills are buffed or nerfed. They hit you seemingly unexpectedly, and the best way to cope with this is just to ignore it and deal with it, since you ain't getting a straight answer from the game as much as you'll ask for it. And do you want to know the worst part? Remember that the first game's inventory system was trash in part because items have realistic names that are not grouped by the category they are in the general list? Well, the issue is still there. Okay, I'll give them that. They created a few subcategories to separate each weapon type, for example, but stuff is still crowded randomly, especially armor. You've got all the headpieces on their own subcategory, sure, but you've got 4 different slots to fill, and items belonging to either of them are only by accident close to one another in this list, which is made worse by the fact that some of them require wearing a certain type of piece on another slot. So for example, you need to wear a padding before you put a coif, so good luck finding them in the right order when you want to switch quickly. Last time I had to endure this crap for the sake of authenticity, but this time around I say fuck this, I'm using a mod. It puts the item type as the first word, so the alphabetical ordering keeps them neatly together. I'm happy, thank God for mods. And you know what? I graciously accept the cost of typos such as sandal Hungarian if that's what it takes for my mental comfort. Despite my complaint about removing illiteracy from the game, I do love what they did with the skill that replaced reading in Kingdom Come 2. Scholarship is not just about reading, but more of a reflection of Henry's knowledge of the world around him. Reading books obviously contributes to that, but even simple conversations with NPCs help it along as you find out interesting things about foreign lands, for example. Even if it helps you read skill books faster, just like in the first game, the main benefit of increasing this is making dialogue checks requiring it easier. And there's a lot of dialogue checks to go through involving each and every skill out there depending on context. The ones relating to scholarships do tend to make Henry sound a bit like an actually smart-ass nerd, but I respect having the option at least. I dedicated quite a bit of time dissecting the game's many mechanics, but at the end of the day, an RPG lives and dies by its dialogue and writing. As far as I'm concerned, I'm more than satisfied with what's on display. The skill checks aren't enjoyable to pass just for the sake of the outcome, but the lines themselves are interesting to hear. The best example I can think of is when you have to deal with people that need treatment in a field hospital, because each issue you can spot requires your expertise in a different subject. Between alchemy, strength, survival, and craftsmanship, passing these checks makes for a genuinely informative and immersive experience. I know that the graphical fidelity of the game makes people think that you'll be shown some of this stuff, but you know what? Having Henry awkwardly faffle around the patient while saying he's turning him upside down to check for injuries is good enough for me. Similar good work has been done when it comes to the world building. Actually, hold on, can I actually call it world building when most of it is sourced straight from the historical records? Anyway, when I said that the general tone is lighthearted, I didn't really cover the other side of the coin. Kingdom Come 2 puts a lot of focus on how war ravages the country, how much devastation it can bring, and just how insane late medieval era politics could be. For the sake of showcasing what I'm talking about, I'll just go through several main points of the game's story, which kinda fall into the spoiler territory, blah blah blah. You're not gonna skip this if you're this far into the video anyway. Who are we fooling here? As a small recap, the big event that's taking place is the real-life war of succession for the crown between Wenceslaus IV of Luxembourg and his brother Sigismund. After the very successful reign of their father Charles IV, the reign of Wenceslaus was marred by a mixture of his own disinterest, his inferior capability as a ruler, and most of all, his inability to rein in the power of the nobles. Events escalated to the point where Sigismund imprisoned his brother, usurped the throne, and invaded Bohemia. Mind you that this is a very brief summary, since the proper description will involve describing the imperial system of the Holy Roman Empire and the fact that this particular war managed to create a third pope, because yeah, there are already two. As interesting as that can of worms might be to unravel, it would drive me insane over the course of the few hours required to make it more sense to the unfamiliar. No, really, it's that unhinged. As I mentioned, Henry and Hans have come to Trosky to deliver a message for Otto von Berghof and the League of Lords. The League was the group that supported Sigismund's claim to the throne, and the message was meant to be a deal that would get the two groups to stop hostilities and put an end to the war. After the setback from the introduction, Henry and Hans spot an opportunity for a comeback, which is attending the wedding of the local bailiff in hopes of Lord von Berghof being on the guest list. After a lot of hard work, they succeed in being invited to the wedding, but the Lord doesn't show up to everyone's concern, and the groom mysteriously vanishes. Fortunately, Henry and Hans miraculously manage to get themselves into more trouble by starting yet another brawl, so yet again they're arrested. That wouldn't have been much of a problem if Hans wasn't about to be executed due to his poaching, which you may be completely unaware of it if you didn't do the relevant side quest. Fortunately, just as he's about to swing, Lord von Berghof finally returns to Trosky in a sorry state, as he's also been caught in an ambush, most likely at the hands of the same people that attacked you earlier. Therefore, despite being on opposite sides of the war, you're put in the situation of having a common problem to contend with. Things only get worse when you realize that the fortress of von Berghof's subject and Nabokov was already captured by the bandits, and the groom was part of the force that attacked him earlier. What follows is a moment that's perhaps one of the game's highlights, because once you arrive at Semin, you're faced with a terrible decision. Despite going there to arrest the groom, one of von Berghof's men insists on threatening to murder the entire estate if they hesitate to give him up. Thinking that Henry's position was already pretty shaky, I elected to side with von Berghof in hopes of helping the goal for which he came to this place to begin with. This results in a complete massacre, which is as horrific as you might imagine. You get to know these people pretty well in the relevant side quests, but more importantly, the wedding you attended made it so that it's next to impossible to be unaware of the characters present in Semin. This is an excellent and brutal example of the horrors of war, and one that is very rarely done in settings that precede the 20th century. With this issue out of the way, von Berghof prepares the assault of the captured fortress, but wouldn't you know it, the army is caught in a massive ambush with arrows, bolts and gunshots peppering from the woodland hills. Yeah, the game has crossbows and firearms, there's a reason I didn't talk about the combat yet. Anyway, there's another awesome segment that really took me by surprise when I saw it. Like, who is booting up a medieval game and expects the trees to talk in gunpowder? After pulling through against the odds, Henry finally faces the bandit leader that gave them so much trouble, and despite managing to injure him, you still get captured. Said bandit leader turns out to be Jan Žižka, a historical figure with an impressive life and an excellent character in the game, but I'm getting ahead of myself. This is the point where the insanity of the situation starts to become obvious. While in captivity, Henry encounters as part of the group none other than Istvan Toth, the first game's antagonist and the man who still has a sword of his father. Those that are perceptive or simply have a good memory will quickly realize that Toth is actually fighting on Sigismund's side, and therefore he should be an ally of von Berghof. Unfortunately for Istvan, Žižka thinks the same thing and realizes that you're actually supposed to fight together, since he is also a supporter of King Wenceslaus' claim to the throne. Yes, the bandits who attacked your company in the introduction only did so because they saw you have a polite discussion with the Trosky captain before you set up camp and concluded that you must be on friendly terms with the League of Lords. If that wasn't enough, there's to be considered the implication of this whole sequence of events. When you ended up meeting with Lord von Berghof and explained the ambush attack, the Margrave only said that he's been having a bandit problem he needs help with. But since now you've been made aware that Istvan Toth has been a spy embedded in Žižka's forces on behalf death of Van Berghoff, it becomes clear that the Lord was more than aware who he was dealing with. This recontextualizes every encounter you had with the Lord of Trosky, because instead of being a cooperative character, he turns out to be a shrewd, manipulative, and very effective actor. After all, the man just had Henry and Hans eliminate all Wenceslaus's loyalists in the region by burning down Semin and capturing and destroying Zhishka's company that captured the Nabokov fortress, all while stringing you along with the promise of negotiating a deal he was never interested in pursuing. Ishvan takes advantage of the whole confusion and escapes the fortress, which is swiftly besieged by von Berghoff and his allies from Prague. Things are looking desperate already when they reveal to have a cannon that has the expected effect on Henry and his newfound allies. I actually liked this moment because until the reveal, the game played it out like any other siege of the series where everything's about to go down to a last man stand against waves of soldiers, so this was a nice twist on that. Henry wakes up in the dungeons of the Trosky castle about to be tortured alongside his companions, and with Hans taken into captivity by Lord von Berghoff as he departs for Kuttenberg. Gruesome scene aside, there's one thing that annoys me about it though. After you get the last minute rescue at the hands of Zhishka's spy, you're tasked with recovering your stuff, getting Van Berghoff's instruction for Toth, and paying the Hungarian a visit to recover your father's sword. All that's fine and dandy, especially since we were bound to have a defenestration in Kingdom Come, but during the torture segment, you are given the option of being uncooperative at the price of being further maimed as punishment. As a consequence, you receive a stat debuff, showing you the rough state Henry was left by these additional mutilations as expected. What's not expected though, is that after you finish the whole segment, the debuff vanishes and Henry makes a full recovery. In other words, your choice to give up on your allies or not has absolutely no gameplay consequences and is purely done for the sake of different lines of text during the dialogue. And to make it more ironic, refusing to give up your companions still leads to the information being given by another of your companions that's desperate to save Henry, so branching paths my ass? I'm very surprised about this massive missed opportunity, an RPG outright refusing to give weight to its dialogue choices. Why? After finishing your job in the castle, you're on the run in the region's tunnels and woods as patrols are sent out to look for you before you finally depart this region for Kuttenberg, where Sigismund's forces are about to strike next. Yep, you heard that right, I have barely finished the first region of the game and it took me about 70 hours to do so. We finally get to the end of this on-rails series of missions as Henry, Zhishka and his spy Catherine arrive at Sukdol, where you plan your next move. So, as the saying goes, there's a lot to unpack here. The scale of the game is absolutely massive. The first game holds no candle to it no matter on which side you look at it. Trosky was already pretty large and packed with locations and activities, but Kuttenberg blows it out of the water in proportions. That's even before mentioning the city itself, which is a work of art on its own right. But until we get there are a few issues that I think need to be highlighted. Well, I'll be honest about this right from the start. The second map of the game does not land its hits as well as the first one. The lack of a hook when entering it sets the tone for this. What do I mean by this? Let's remember what happened in Trosky for a moment. You camp next to the lake, you get through the whole ambush, running away and all that jazz, and at the end you end up in the village tavern where you have a clear view of your goal, Trosky Castle, as you get told that you need to attend the wedding as a means to get there. It gives you a clear direction that you need to take by presenting a distant view of the castle as if it's a forbidden fruit of sorts, and then it follows up with quests that are meant to get you exploring right away, as I mentioned earlier, which sums up to an excellent way to present the region to the player. What does Kuttenberg have? After an extremely intense ending of a chapter, the second region greets you with a very flat field, then a visit to Sukdol Fortress where you meet some new allies, after which you depart with Zhishka to the Devil's Den, a tavern where only criminals and bandits congregate. Incidentally, the trip serves as a means to explore the new map, and it's one of the few instances where you get the choice to skip it, something that would have been much more useful in many other instances instead of this one, which is very ironic, I know. And a large part of the start of the trip is also through a very large, flat, open field with very few interesting features. And to top it all off, the den itself is in the dense forest with no landmarks to catch your eye. You don't pass close enough to Sigmund's army camp to notice it, and you're nowhere near the city to draw your curiosity and tempt you to visit it as soon as you can, even if it's on the opposite side of where you start from. Like, I wanted to be generous and say that you're still fresh from the reaction of seeing the game having a second map that's also bigger than the first, but I don't think anyone can deny that the hook isn't there, at least besides how hooked you get to the story itself, which is its own thing anyway. Then there's the map itself. It still has a huge number of landmarks, beautifully crafted places, quests, and overall things to keep you busy in a meaningful way. I'd be nuts to deny any of this. But it also includes a lot of empty areas, such as fields and straight roads that are frankly uninteresting. I'm being a tad unfair with this, since this is after all how the origin is in reality, and I'm not going to complain too much about it as a consequence. But what I can harp on about is that the vast majority of churches you encounter on your trips are closed. I can excuse the big cathedrals in Kuttenberg, since each would be a monumental task to pursue for a warhorse, but the churches? Come on, man. The first game had plenty you could visit on a much smaller map, so the second having none is a big head scratcher. Have they ran out of time to make them? They just dropped the thing entirely? More likely is the fact that Warhorse cited the presence of detailed churches as one of the reasons the first game ran like crap. Even if I'd accept this reasoning, it surely sticks like a sore thumb in a game where the church and the first seedlings of the Hussite Wars are very important parts of the world that's being depicted. So it's kind of a shame they are missing. And if that wasn't enough, there's another thing that's pretty painful. The progression sucks. Or better said, it's definitely overtuned for what Warhorse assumed the average player would be. Look, I'm not going to deny that most people are blitzing through the main storyline, of course they are. But from the shoes of someone that went and did all the side quests that he could, the progression is really bad. Like at the end of the Trosky chapter, most of my skills were close to level 20 out of the maximum 30, with extremely strong equipment to boot and loaded with money. Don't mistake level 20 as simply being 2/3 of the maximum power either. Level 15 already makes a specific skill really strong and without many challenges when using it. My issues with stealth were already happening before I finished the first region, for example. That whole sneaking in the woods to escape Trosky's soldiers was laughably easy to pull off to the detriment of the set piece. The only aspect of the game that sort of adjusts itself is the difficulty of combat, because the enemies in the second region are much better equipped. Otherwise, if you are diligent with your questing, you're blowing everything out of the water. And it doesn't even stop here. Not content with handing you the best horse of the game right at the start, now you also have the possibility of instantly getting the best sword too. Assuming you have good crafting, which you will because repairing your equipment is objectively the correct thing to do, you'll be able to take your father's sword from Ishvan Toft's possession and reforge it with Toledo's steel into the best longsword of the game right away. Another baffling approach, but at least I can find some justifications. Yes, the sword is one of the most important parts of the story, with it being half of the justification of Henry's revenge mission and all that. But man, why give the player this option so quickly? Why can't you use it first as it is and only later need to complete the mission in which you get rewarded with the knowledge how to reforge it? It doesn't help that the initial sword is already stronger than anything you could find in Trosky, so you jump from "this weapon is strong but I'll upgrade to something else later" to completely not needing to bother with any other sword until the end of the game. There are a bunch of unique swords that you'll toss straight into your stash because they will always be inferior. It's such a waste. To make the irony even hit deeper, the sword itself is labeled as a quest item, meaning that you're forced to carry and you can't even put it into your horse's saddlebags. I also mentioned the economy is broken, and yes, it really is. In the first part of the game, you're scrounging up for every bit of cash you can get your hands on, but this quickly devolves once you start looting every piece of equipment from the corpses of your enemies. Armor in particular is pricey, so the ideal thing is to load stuff up on your horse and sell it the first chance you get. Sure, it's a gamey and cheesy way to approach things, but if it really didn't want me to do something like this, maybe I shouldn't have been given such an obvious way to do it either. The limiting factor is the merchant's available cash, but you can get a ton of useful equipment for essentially free when you have the big sale lined up. Remember, kids, kids, bartering is legitimate economic activity. Don't let the mercantilists say otherwise. Since you also don't have to waste money on buying horses, I haven't forgotten about you by the way, that's even more money in your pocket for you to spend on the best gear in shops. Did I forget to mention that your father's swords and its upgraded version are completely free to obtain? Sneaking around and robbing everyone blind is also a very lucrative strategy. Okay, at the start you have to take a lot of precautions because you can easily be detected, but that doesn't last long. Level up stealth and thievery enough and you can speedrun every single building you can access, including shops of all kinds. The drawback of increased patrols and hearing constant offhanded comments from NPCs about the rising crime served nowhere near enough of a deterrent to literally line your pockets to your heart's desire. And the fact that I'm saying stealing is easy to do has nothing to do with me and all to do with the game. Stop saying otherwise, you filthy Hungarian swine! That brings us to combat, which is also plagued by issues with progression. Now, I'll give Caesar what belongs to Caesar. The start of Kingdom Come 2 isn't as rough as the original game. Your stats are low, but not hopeless, so for new players it's definitely a less punishing experience. I know it made perfect sense for Henry's journey to start with him being useless with a weapon, but it's also one of the common complaints of those who gave up on it early on, alongside the awkward control during combat. Set control is slightly better this time around, but there's nothing fundamentally different about how it works. That's also why I'm somewhat the wrong person to ask about this, because there is an element of practice I went through already when I played the first game multiple times, so for me the system's fluid and fine for the most part. Spamming attack still works, but it's not the broken I win strategy anymore, so there's that. The only time when it gets frustrating is when you face 3 or more opponents at once and you start fighting the autofocus just as hard as the enemies in front of you, which is something that was happening in the first game as well. There are also a few new additions that people expected from the first title but are welcomed here nevertheless, since later is better than never or something like that. New weapons are present, including ball arms, which are finally inventory items and not just some stuff that you carried around and swung awkwardly, and they have their own skills and combos. But even more noticeable is the introduction of crossbows and firearms as shown by Zizka's merciless ambush I talked about earlier. In this regard I really like what Warhorse did, because they weren't just content with adding a single crossbow type and calling a day. They actually went their way and introduced different styles of this weapon. You have light crossbows that can be hand-drawn and reloaded more rapidly, but also heavier ones that needed pulleys to be drawn and take their sweet time to get the bolt ready to fire. The skill requirements to use them are actually a reflection of the advantages crossbows presented to real-life armies, because despite their slower reload times, they required very little training and abilities compared to the bow and arrow. As a result of that, you can use the crossbows almost straight away, but at the cost of slower firing rate and having to pay more for one. There are also more types of firearms, but these work almost identical between each other. I have to be honest here, they're kinda useless for the most part unless you really want style points at the start of a fight. Loading a ball takes forever, igniting the gun takes a sweet time, and aiming with one is mostly a crapshoot due to how inaccurate these guns were in the reality. But at least they're in the game. Their main benefit is if you somehow get lucky and actually hit someone, they're guaranteed kill. But the combat and AI really weren't designed around using one, that's for sure. But of course, the focus of the combat is again on swords. Other weapons may have skills and combos to get them some sort of parity, but the story is about knights. Knights use swords, and therefore the game is designed around swords whether you like it or not. Like a true contrarian that respects himself, I played almost exclusively with a sword, and at the end of the Trosky section I was massacring people left and right. You're welcome. The second chapter raises the bar quite a bit, but after you level up enough, you'll become a one-man army nevertheless. The dominance of swords is further cemented by the Master Strikes, which are essentially parries with a devastating counter mixed into it and exclusive to swords. They do involve a bit of skill to trigger them, but they're easy to pull off with practice anyway, since they require you swinging in the opposite direction of your opponent's attack as he's about to hit you. At least in this case, the hardcore mode presents an extra challenge since it removes the UI that is quite helpful in normal normal mode. But I can't leave this topic without marking the most significant improvement over the first game. The AI is much improved in Kingdom Come 2 when it comes to combat. There's not even a comparison. Fighting against multiple enemies can get fairly spicy since they don't hesitate to gang up on you. It's not perfect and it has its dumb moments, but you have to put some effort to get the constant comedy gold the first game produced regularly. In other areas, it's not stellar, it gets confused when you're doing stealth kills for example, but at least it's much more consistent than last time around. But man, when playing DICE it goes for absolutely suicidal plays so damn often. Yeah, sure, I'm many points ahead, but maybe stop throwing away thousands of points by rolling a single die? So in the end, what does Kuttenberg region offer? The region itself is also beautiful and extremely detailed with a lot of interesting landmarks. Sure, the Trosky region had the castle as the main landmark that was more or less visible from anywhere on the map, which is extremely awesome by the way, but Kuttenberg has multiple castles, forests, a sprawling winery, a beautiful monastery, and the city of Kuttenberg itself. I have to make a very special shout out to whoever designed the forests in this game. Not only they're extremely beautiful to look at, but they're dense as hell. Whenever I was looking for something in the woods, the abundant foliage, shrubbery and trees meant I was more likely to find it right as I'm stepping over it. I'm not talking about random objects either. If you're looking for a camp and it's not lit by torches in the middle of the pitch black night, well, good luck finding it before the reverse happens. Not exactly the best way to enjoy a nature stroll. It's a bit amusing to think that by cluttering the vegetation, Kingdom Come 2 managed to create the most honest-to-life forest I've seen in a video game. As I mentioned already, this region boasts several castles, and here is yet another missed opportunity I have to mention. It's not as bad as is the case with the inaccessible churches, but there are several of them that you can only enter during specific moments of the main story and never outside of that. It's a massive shame because there was a monumental effort in getting them into the game, so I see no reason why you'd keep them closed up like that. Trosky's castle at least had a narrative sense to block your access at the start, but afterwards you're free to visit it at any time you want. Yes, even after escaping from their torture dungeon, you're being left alone even if it was the one opportunity it would have made the most sense to not get access to anymore. I bemoaned the performance issues the first game had in Rat Eye, but using the same system as back as then, I noticed very few issues now. And when you consider that Rat Eye is basically the size of a small portion of Kuttenberg, it's safe to say that there were leaps and bounds of performance improvements in that area. I absolutely love that it doesn't shy away from showing just how dirty a town of this era could get. You've got muddy streets littered with trash and literally shit. You have houses whose walls are stained by the latrines hanging outside. You've got pig pens in the middle of the street right next to shops and other dwellings, construction site debris, and so many things in that direction. Just look at how bleak this place looks with piles of trash rolling down the hill, smoke from coal-burning huts in the distance, and the side of the hill peppered with mining sterile in the same place. And despite this long list, the place isn't filled with misery porn because most buildings are gorgeous to look at. If you're a fan of medieval architecture, the city has everything you could ask for in spades, and you have a wonderful astronomical clock right next to the Rathaus. Yeah, Prague wasn't the only Czech city to boast one of these mechanical wonders, and it's actually a DLC's main point of focus. Yeah, I'll talk about the DLCs later. Hold your horses. Yes, wonderful puns once again, I'm great at this. And if there is one thing that strikes me a lot when it comes to this game, is just how absolutely filled to the brim with details it is. It's impossible to be in a place where you don't have something interesting to look at. Maybe you have the stocked shelves in a random peasant house, or the items on display in a shop, an abandoned house on the edge of the town, and even hints of things that are relevant during specific quests. I mentioned earlier that you're investigating a tanner's connection to a gang of poachers, and well, the signs are always there to see if you're looking hard enough, even before starting the mission itself. All these little things not only bring a significant amount of depth visually, but they also serve to tying everything into a coherent, living and plausible world. If you go hard enough into the details, you're able to map out where every member of a village lives and how their lives intertwine in a logical logical way when you consider the things you discover about them as you go about with your adventures. But, and that's a big but, there's a downside to this amount of detail, and that is a lot of the items you see scattered around are non-interactable, even if they are exactly the same kind of things you could carry in your own inventory. It took me quite a while to shake off my instinct to nick some of the things that looked interesting because I kept realizing they're just set dressing. What I'm trying to say is that this is an outrageous case of anti-Romanian discrimination. And if you're getting tired of these kind of jokes, I'll have you know that there are horse thieves that the game euphemistically calls black market horse traders. In Trosky, they're the gypsies from the camp, and in Kuttenberg, they have Romanian names. Yeah, I've got nothing to add to this one, guys. Can't top this. You know what? This one's yours, game. You win. You win. And after all that, there are more quests, so many more to tackle on this map. It somehow still manages to keep them varied and surprising, and I was expecting on getting bored by the repeated tasks, and I wasn't. We're talking about another 60 hours at the very least that I've gone through doing all secondary quests that were available before progressing more into the main story. I frankly have no idea how they pulled it off, yet they did. The only unfortunate side effect to the length of time it takes to go through with everything is that it can make the gameplay loop get stale. It certainly doesn't help that you get incredibly good at mostly everything, which takes the challenge away as well. But can we really complain that at over 125 hours in, the gameplay hasn't brought up fresh tricks in some time? I know I've been talking for over a year now, but over a year? Over an hour, man, come on. But I haven't lost my senses yet, okay? The main quest continues pretty strong as well. I won't go into details again because there's no point in spoiling more of the story. What's certain is that the main quest comes into even more shapes and sizes compared to the side quests. This is partially my fault, but my own approach was to clean most of the map of side missions before proceeding with the rest of the story, and the result is that I don't recommend you doing the same. I ended up feeling a bit burnt out by all the side missions and their lack of weight to the overall story, because of course they wouldn't matter, they're side missions. But it's a bit funny seeing Henry getting invested in one set of random people he'll never interact with again after another, particularly since in the main storyline Henry's dedication is one of the core parts of his personality. But once I got back in the proverbial saddle of the main missions, I once again felt the tingle of what made Kingdom Come 2 great. The set pieces it has from time to time are awesome, the characters you keep interacting with are loads of fun, and the writing, for the lack of better word, actually respects your time. I say this because a lot of time is dedicated to explaining the important questions regarding the stated goals of Henry and his companions. I'm talking about the what, why, how, and when. All this being the foundation of not only good writing in general, but also represent a very healthy practice in anyone's day-to-day life. Yes, the story deals with a lot of complex concepts that it needs to lay down because few are experts in 15th century history, but it does so in a clear, detailed, but concise manner. Since the story is pretty balls deep into the politics revolving around the Bohemian War of Succession, the fact that the game makes sure everything is not only explained but also in a manner that doesn't read like an exposition dump is extremely commendable. How many games can pull off showing the political landscape of 15th century nobles in the context of tasking you with attempting to forge new alliances? I am also a massive fan of the depth these descriptions go to, because I was never left in a position where things weren't clear. Frankly, the only time that felt a bit confusing revolved around important characters using very different models than in the first game, and the simple fact that it's been 4 years since I last played through the story and needed a refresher from time to time. For a story that's so dense in detail, I'd say this is a very respectable track record. Extremely commendable. The characters you encounter are again a great part of the experience. It shouldn't be a surprise to hear that one of the standouts is by far Jan Žižka. He's a ruthless pragmatist, an excellent tactician, and an overall joy to interact with. In reality, the man is considered to be one of Czechia's national heroes, so this overall positive portrayal makes perfect sense, of course. But there's a whole host of memorable characters. The Dry Devil is giving him a run for his money, while Adar and Janos are a complete riot of a duo. I also really enjoyed meeting the French knight that, alongside bragging about improbable feats, left an Easter egg about the last duel, the historic event turned into a book and then turned into a movie directed by Ridley Scott that somehow isn't a complete mess on the historical representation front. Yeah, sometimes he's able to pull that off when he wants to. Okay, that helmet was dumb as fuck, but you get the point. I know that both games are all about Henry and his journey, but it's actually a good thing to have side characters that are significantly cooler than the main protagonist. That of course doesn't mean Henry is boring. He may act the role of slightly naive goody two-shoes, but Warhorse made the wise choice of diving deeper into his motivations. We all know this is a revenge story, but it's not played out as just that. Henry isn't a man who rises from nothing to become a grandiose hero, but a guy who has to deal with deep trauma at the end of the day. I know they partially did it as a means to introduce the story to those who never played the first game, but the introductory segment is one step away from having Henry scream that the trees are speaking Hungarian with how heavy-handed the PTSD is shown. The thing is that on this front, Kingdom Come 2 is not very committed in what it tries to do. When people said that the first game is romanticizing the era at the detriment of a grounded story, I wasn't expecting an overcorrection, and thankfully we don't have that in the sequel. But it's clear that Warhorse took the impression to heart and tried to address it somehow. That somehow ended up being a timid half measure consisting of a few nightmares Henry is subjected to around some important parts of the story and nothing much more than that. The heavy choice regarding Semin that I praised so much earlier gets mentioned here and there afterwards, but I never felt that Henry gets the chance to actually feel guilty about it. The Kuttenberg section puts you in a similar position at one stage in an arguably a more clear-cut moment that can define his morality. Only that kinda meh in comparison. The people that are affected by this second choice are irrelevant. You didn't get much of a chance to interact with them, so there is little reason to protect them beyond your own personal opinion as a person sitting in front of the computer. And, that's kind of not enough, I think, in a narrative-driven story. Ironically, the best representation of PTSD is Hans Capon's newly acquired claustrophobia after being buried under rubble at Nebakov, which leaves him unable to use tunnels in important story missions. His description of what he's going through is pretty compelling and you generally feel sorry for him. And then he cures himself after being forced to use a tunnel mission later. Really, Warhorse? Are you really tossing away something so good and necessary for the portrayal of a non-romanticized 15th century? It's beyond any shadow of a doubt that the game is as dedicated to the portrayal of history as it was in the first game. There's a long list of topics that feature and could legitimately count as educational, be it related to society, culture, or things like schools of swordsmanship. Not everything is seamlessly integrated. For example, during a questline investigating an illegal counterfeiting operation, you get to learn about how silver mining was done via a long expositional dialogue series of options in which your conversation partner dryly recites his lesson. Do I mind that? Not really, but being a witness to a city council is a neater way to introduce people to how this aspect of medieval life takes place, as for example. The first game felt at times more like an educational material, which I personally didn't find upsetting, but the sequel leans more towards a sort of cinematic, I fucking hate this word, cinematic experience of the era while still going the effort to show the tidbits of the time period. Okay, time for the spicy topic. I generally don't like to do this kind of stuff, and I avoided this when I talked about the first game. Yes, I'm talking about that fucking stupid Eurogamer article. You know which one I'm talking about if you're so damn far into the video anyway. So naturally, the presence of the fictional Musa of Mali in the sequel caused quite a bit of stir, not only because he's an African in 15th century Bohemia, but because of the stuff he's saying. In the first part, as far as I'm concerned, it falls into the same handwave territory that could be used to dismiss the aforementioned article, funnily enough. There may or may not have been an African in 15th century Bohemia, and showing one is basically down to the developer's choice because of this uncertainty. You have the backstory of him being an educated man that traveled in many places and ended up in Sigismund's service after meeting him in Istanbul while spending time in the Sultan's court, so at least you have the plausible deniability set. That's fine as far as I'm concerned. And then there's the discussion over what he's saying. As we learn about him, he goes on to say about the wonderfully civilized place he comes from and all sorts of amazing cities he has witnessed in his travels. But the more you talk with him, the more he shares to Henry about the wonders of the world. He sneaks in plenty of jabs directed at Christians, Czechs and Europeans in general, and some have taken this to interpret as a game's way to mock the aforementioned categories. Only that Musa is portrayed as an absolute bigoted jackass. No, really, he is. It's extremely ironic that Henry, a man that's incredibly open-minded despite only traveling a bit within his kingdom, like in the span of like a couple of 100 kilometers, has to talk to a guy that traveled across dozens of kingdoms, nations, cultures, and otherwise experienced things that should have left him more open-minded than Henry could ever hope for, and yet is more close-minded than most of the people you meet in either of the games. There's no way I can look at how Musa interprets the vast cultural richness of the Mediterranean world with the same depth of a peasant who never left his tiny hamlet and conclude that the writers were actually rooting for him. The idea itself is absurd. To make matters worse, the main story involves a pogrom at some stage, a very good segment of the story by the way, no, not in that way, and even then, the people who call for this abhorrent act are shown to do it in just for purely financial and strategic reasons and think less discriminatory than this learned scholar, alleged learned scholar at least. Von Berghoff and Marquardt von Aulitz, despite being clearly portrayed as evil and the antagonists of the story and as cruel people for ordering this thing, don't get even close to mentioning the Jews in the same way Musa talks about the European Christians, as absurd as it may sound. Yes, guys that call for pogroms are more enlightened than this jackass. So in conclusion, no, Kingdom Come 2 does not abandon its principles or gave up on the ideals that drove the first game forward. This whole thing looks like an irony that flew way too close to the sun for people to catch on. I guess we deserve it. Now that we're 1 year in its release, it means I was able to try my hands at the 3 planned DLCs the game had to offer. These are in the order of their release: Brushes with Death, followed by Legacy of the Forge, and finally Mysteria Ecclesiae. Brushes with Death's focus is a mysterious painter called Wojta that attempts to finalize his masterpiece while dealing with the issues. The structure isn't anything out of the world, just a series of quests that attempt to stretch your travels to as many different places as possible. I highly advise you to start playing it as soon as you can, because its fetching is perfectly tolerable while you're juggling a bunch of different quests at the same time. I started this questline quite a bit later and ended up going through a bunch of not very enjoyable back and forth travels, but I raise my hand and say, it's my fault, not the DLCs for that one. Once I aligned it with my current activities, it became a perfectly tolerable experience, even if it tends to take you into less beaten paths on the Kuttenberg map. What I can fault the DLC for is how uninteresting its main character is. He's actually annoying in a he makes me uneasy kind of way. If the theme of the DLC's story was something closer to horror, it could have worked better, but it isn't, so Wojta's constant quirks and deflections made me willing to slap his face instead of wanting to help and understand him better. Out of all people I did quests for in the whole game, he made me wish I could screw him over the most. That's how infuriating he got. He's not awfully done as a character, and there's quite a bit of theory crafting out there relating to his real story, and that's usually an indicator of a job well done after all. But man, is it weird seeing Henry becoming very emotionally attached to a guy that constantly hides his true intentions, all while being unsettling in a really obvious manner. Otherwise, you're rewarded with a large array of shield paint options and potentially a pretty strong longsword. Problem is that the sword is acquired long after you can get the best sword of the game I talked about earlier, and since longswords can be normally used with a shield, not great. Pretty disappointing DLC overall, even before realizing that its length is rather modest. Moving on, Legacy of the Forge focuses on Henry's efforts to rebuild the smithy in which his stepfather Martin worked as a young man in Kuttenberg. Since you find the place in a dilapidated state, it's not hard to make a connection to one of the first game's DLCs from the ashes. And the main principles are mostly there. You pay from your own pocket to renovate the place and purchase tools, furniture and other features that bring their own benefits and bonuses. There aren't many choices that exclude others when it comes to set bonuses this time around, and frankly, the whole premise over the rebuild makes much more sense here as well. That's because despite being a money sink, it comes hand in hand with other things to do and offers a fairly lucrative revenue once you put in the effort. Most importantly, it comes with a fairly developed questline that manages to touch quite a bit of things worth mentioning. The main thing would be that Henry interacting with the medieval guild system, which forced craftsmen to respect a strict series of guidelines if they wanted to practice their craft within a city. In this case, we're even talking about completely forbidding smiths born outside of Kuttenberg from joining and practicing their trade within the city's walls, which Henry bypasses on the convenient technicality of being the son of a former member, and they don't know he's actually adopted. Anyway, or at least by pretending he was, the guild system has been a core part of the medieval economic system for centuries, and it's really nice seeing it portrayed here with both its regulatory role and arbitrary whims at the same time. Another issue you can tackle in this DLC is fixing Kuttenberg's astronomical clock that hasn't been working for over 20 years. After the city council brought in Italian masters whose intervention survived the story of the Italian scam,
Anti-Italian discrimination.
Henry discovers the old diagrams left by Martin back when he had his own attempt to get the clock running again. So now you have the chance to solve the issue, and the questline is fairly rewarding as an experience overall. It's certainly another memorable milestone of the DLC because the clock is actually cool as hell once you get it running. But the bread and butter is using the smithy itself, and here we have quite a few interesting things to look after. On its own, having a smithy is not interesting at all, considering that there's a bunch that serve the same purpose throughout the map, but after you restart the activity of the place, you start receiving commissions that get generated every day, and completing them rewards you with money and blacksmith's prestige. The latter is a new attribute that unlocks things to repair and build, opens up access to a whole list of activities related to your smithy, but it also impacts the passive income of your shop. Raising it high enough and stashing enough quality things inside the store's chest, including stuff you looted, can bag you with quite a bit of money every day, far offsetting the tens of thousands of groschen you'll sink into renovating the place. After how little I had to say about the first DLC, it feels almost strange to now turn around and say that there's little point in describing the many other activities that come packaged in Legacy of the Forge. I'm not doing it because they're boring, since they aren't, but there's no point further dissecting something that has an easy way to anticipate its conclusion. Yeah, I hope you aren't shocked I actually like this DLC. Who would have guessed? Wow! Completely worth the purchase, brings a ton of things into the game that enhances the experience, unless you actually hate the smithing mechanic, in which case sucks to be you, I guess. Then there's a third DLC, Mysteria Ecclesiae, which is about another visit into a monastery. This time we're tasked to escort a well-renowned master physician that's in the service of King Wenceslas and seeks permission to attend to him. Remember that Sigismund keeps his brother imprisoned in Vienna around the time the story takes place, just in case you forgot. What seems to be a straightforward request for an audience with King Sigismund becomes a complicated affair as the monastery's abbot also asks for assistance in dealing with the mysterious illness that recently popped up on the premises and quickly degenerates into something a lot more dangerous. Funnily enough, this DLC feels like an attempt to amend things not just for one, but two elements of the original game. First of all, the monastery segment in the first game was a part I personally liked, but for quite a few players it was a chore since it was putting a stop to the main story pacing, introduced a lot of restrictions with its scheduling, and it went as far as to potentially softlock progress if things were not done in the specific order. I didn't have any of these issues, but I can see why suddenly being locked away from the main game wouldn't be fun for everyone. So in this case, you're not restricted by the monastic life since you're just a guest. You have access to most of the place, and the few restrictions that do come are manageable for the lack of a better and non-spoilery word. The second thing it tries to make up for is how in the first game's A Woman's Lot DLC, you're forced into a complete multi-hour playthrough without any prior warning. Well, Mysteria Ecclesiae also throws you into a series of quests you can't escape from until you finish it, but at least it has the decency to give you a full screen warning, this is about to happen. Although it was a bit funny that in the moment of not paying attention, I somehow felt this warning was concerning the game's main story and not a piece of side content. You know, I should sleep more when I'm playing, I suppose. Do these two things do enough to get back into the good graces of the people slighted by what I mentioned? Well, I think it's at least a pretty damn good effort, but most importantly, this DLC is very enjoyable. Sedlet's Monastery is a nice place to explore, there's quite a bit of things to do, and last but not least, it has a nice storyline to progress through, particularly if you love murder mysteries. You've got some interesting characters and an enticing mystery to solve that keeps dragging you in deeper and deeper as each twist reveals itself until the end. The only drawback is that it's rather short. It took me roughly 7 hours from start to finish with all the running around in circles. But I can't conclude without mentioning how arbitrary and silly one segment was. You'll end up having to craft yourself a plague mask, which requires you to get hold of a piece of rope. That's fine and dandy with all the construction, hop plantations and rest of the stuff laying around here, right? Well, wrong. You can only pick up a specific piece of rope that looks identical to all the other pieces of rope that are laying around and are just props. And you have to guess which one it is because they look identical, as I just mentioned earlier. Are you serious, Warhorse? That being said, it's a good DLC, but as you can see, it's not spectacular either in its own way. But overall, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 is an amazing game. This isn't me being hyperbolic for the sake of forcing excitement into this review. The game's absolutely worthy of this characterization. I'd be impressed enough by the jump in quality between its predecessor and this one, but the fact that Warhorse managed this while expanding the game to such ridiculous scales is something I find few words to describe and reflect the level of my admiration towards their efforts. Completing it rivals the time required to do the same for Witcher 3. It's operating at this scale, in case you're wondering. Yeah, between playing it, writing the script in between and dealing with my regular life, yes, I have one, this game has hooked me for the past 4 months. Yeah, I expected to just play this over my Christmas holidays and be done with it, and now I feel extremely naive for believing that. For fans of historical reenactments, it's as much of a goldmine as the first game was, and between these two and Pentiment, we've got pretty clear signs that there will be an interest for more games in similar settings. Exciting times are ahead. Thanks to everyone for watching, especially the absolute chads that were able to do it in one take without any breaks. Actually, psychos. But anyway, until next time, cheers.